Story number 1. The Whispering Doll. When Lila's family moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, it felt like a fresh start. The house was big, creaky, and covered in dust like a forgotten memory. The kind of house that looked abandoned, even though people still lived there. It was the perfect place for her parents to escape the bustle of city life, to find peace. But for Lila, it was different. She was only 8 years old, small for her age, but with a mind full of curiosity. The house was full of strange corners and dark hallways, places she didn't want to explore at first. But one day, while playing in the attic, she found something hidden away in the farthest corner behind old, forgotten furniture. It was a doll, a porcelain doll, its face pale and cracked with age, its glass eyes wide open as if it was still waiting for something. Lila didn't think much of it at first. She picked it up, brushed off the dust, and stared into its cold, lifeless eyes. It wasn't the prettiest doll. In fact, it was a little creepy, but she was used to playing with old toys. Her mom had told her stories of her own childhood, about toys that had been passed down through generations, and Lila thought it might be just another one of those. She didn't realize yet that it was different. That night, after her parents had tucked her into bed, Lila drifted into a restless sleep. The house groaned and settled, the wind howling outside, but something was off. She didn't know it then, but the doll had found its place beside her bed, sitting on the nightstand where she had left it earlier. Its glass eyes stared at her, unwavering. It started small. At first, it was just a whisper, barely audible, like the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Lila turned over in her sleep, brushing it off as part of the house's creaky noises. But the whispering didn't stop. It became a soft voice calling her name. Lila, Lila. She awoke with a start, her heart racing, but the room was silent. The doll was still there, unmoved, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, the whispering returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from the doll itself, its porcelain mouth barely moving as if it was speaking through the air itself. Lila, come closer. Her parents were asleep, oblivious to the growing fear in her heart. They brushed off her cries, told her it was just her imagination, but Lila knew the truth. The doll was watching her, waiting for her. And every night the whispers grew louder, more desperate. As days passed, things started to get worse. Lila's sleep grew more restless. Her arms, once smooth, began to bruise, small, dark marks that appeared out of nowhere. She'd wake up in the morning, feeling the sting, but no one had been near her. No one but the doll. One night, it was different. Lila woke up to find the doll had moved. Not just a little, but enough that it was sitting on her pillow, staring at her face. Its glass eyes glittered in the moonlight, cold and unblinking. "Why won't you play with me, Lila?" the doll whispered, its voice more urgent, more real than ever before. Lila could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words got caught in her throat. She reached out with trembling hands to push the doll away, but as soon as her fingers brushed its porcelain skin, she felt it. A cold, almost unnatural presence moving through the room. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, and she could feel the doll's anger, a deep, suffocating rage that seemed to swell inside the room. The whispers came faster now, filling her head with thoughts that weren't her own. You took me. You woke me up. Now you belong to me. Lila's scream tore through the house, but no one came. Her parents were far away, lost in their own world, unaware of the horrors unfolding in the dark corners of the house. Lila didn't know what to do. She didn't know what the doll wanted, but she felt its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. It had been waiting for her. Days turned into a blur of whispered voices and nightmares, until finally, Lila couldn't take it anymore. She had to destroy it. Destroy the thing that had been haunting her, tormenting her in the silence of the night. With shaking hands, she gathered every ounce of courage she had left. She picked up the doll, its porcelain cold and smooth under her fingertips, and she smashed it against the wall. The sound of the doll breaking echoed through the house, a sharp crack that seemed to tear the very air apart. For a moment, everything was still. And then, just before she collapsed in exhaustion, she heard it. One final whisper, barely audible. "You can't destroy me, Lila. I'll be waiting, always." The whispering doll was gone, but its memory, its curse, remained. Story number 2. The Shadow in the Hallway. Tommy had always been a good boy, quiet, obedient, and never one to wander too far from the safety of his home. But there was something about their new house on the edge of town that unsettled him. It wasn't the creaky floors or the way the windows rattled when the wind picked up. No, it was something else entirely. A feeling that crawled up his spine every time he walked down the hallway. It started small, just a flicker in the corner of his eye. A shadow that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. Tommy would hurry past it, chalking it up to tired eyes or his imagination. But every night the shadow returned. It would stretch long across the hallway, dark and heavy, just out of sight. Too far to see clearly, but close enough for him to feel it, like it was waiting, watching. At first, Tommy tried to ignore it. He told himself it was nothing. The house was old after all. The house made strange noises, and shadows could play tricks on a kid's mind. But it wasn't just the shadow that bothered him, it was the voice. It started one night after Tommy had crept out of his bed to grab a glass of water. As he passed the darkened hallway, he heard it, a low, rasping whisper that seemed to call his name. Tommy. He froze, heart thudding in his chest. The voice sounded like it was coming from the hallway itself, deep and croaky, like someone, or something, was waiting for him. Tommy shook his head, trying to tell himself it was just the wind or the house settling, but the voice came again, this time louder. "Tommy, come closer." Tommy didn't want to listen, but something inside him, something dark, urged him forward. It was like a magnet pulling him down the hallway, the shadows stretching longer the closer he got. The door at the far end of the hallway, the one his mother had always kept locked, seemed to beckon him. Tommy didn't know why, but he couldn't stop himself from staring at it. His feet were moving on their own, his body a prisoner to the voice. It was only when his mother called out from the kitchen, her voice breaking the spell, that Tommy snapped back to reality. His legs trembled, and he turned quickly, running back to his room without a second thought. He shoved his face into his pillow, trying to block out the voice, but it was always there, just below the surface of his thoughts. The days passed, and the shadow only grew stronger. Tommy's mother noticed the change in him. He was more tired than usual, more withdrawn. His eyes were always darting toward the hallway, as though he was waiting for something to happen. She chalked it up to him being a kid, maybe just scared of the dark or the unfamiliarity of the house. But she had her own suspicions. There were things about the house, old stories she had heard from the neighbors, that made her uneasy. She just never thought they were true. One night, after Tommy had been acting strange all evening, she found him standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't like him to be up this late, especially without her knowing. And it wasn't like him to stand still like that, staring at the old door that had been locked for years. He wasn't moving, wasn't even blinking. "Tommy," she called softly, her voice trembling. but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the door, and he didn't seem to notice her presence at all. The air around him felt thick, like something was pressing in on them both. She stepped forward, her feet heavy against the floor, and then she saw it. The shadow. It had moved. It wasn't just a flicker in the corner anymore. It had grown, stretched out in front of Tommy, and now it was almost tangible, reaching toward him like a hand, blacker than night. She froze, the blood in her veins turning cold. "Tommy, get away from it!" she screamed, but it was too late. The shadow reached out, fingers made of darkness curling around Tommy's wrist. He didn't flinch. He didn't even try to pull away. His eyes were wide, fixed on the locked door as though he could see something through it, something that called to him from within. Before she could reach him, the shadow yanked him forward, pulling him into its cold embrace. Tommy's body jerked, his feet sliding across the floor, but his eyes never left the door, and then, with a sound like a whispered breath, the shadow faded back into the dark, leaving only a whisper of Tommy's name in its wake. "Tommy, come closer." Tommy's mother ran toward him, pulling him into her arms, but he was limp, his face pale and cold. It wasn't like him. She backed away from the hallway, tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't stop looking at the door, the one that had been locked for so many years. Tommy didn't speak for days after that. He never spoke about what had happened, never explained the voice or the shadow. But his eyes always flickered toward the hallway, and every night when the house grew quiet, he would whisper to himself, a phrase he couldn't remember. "It's waiting, it's waiting." And the shadow, still lingering in the darkness, was waiting too. Story number 3. The Eyes in the Closet. Sarah had always loved her room. It was small, cozy, with soft blue walls and a window that let the sunlight pour in during the day. The closet, tucked into the corner, was her favorite part. It was a quiet little space where she could hide away from the world, a sanctuary from the noise of life outside. No one could bother her there. She used it to store her things, her clothes, and sometimes just to sit and think. But that was before Mr. Hargrove, the old man next door, died. It happened one cold autumn night. Sarah's parents had always told her that Mr. Hargrove wasn't someone to worry about, just an old man who kept to himself. But after he passed away, everything changed. The house next door, which had always seemed so quiet and still, suddenly felt different. It felt empty, and so did Sarah's closet. At first, she didn't notice it. The change was subtle, like the air thickening ever so slightly. It started with a faint tapping sound. It was so soft that at first, Sarah thought she was imagining it, just the house settling, she told herself. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that, tap, tap, tap. She'd lie in bed trying to ignore it, but the sound was always there, growing a little louder each time. She told her parents about it, but they just shrugged it off. "It's just the house, honey," her mom would say, giving her a gentle smile. "Old houses make noises." Sarah didn't argue. She tried to believe them, but something in the pit of her stomach told her it was more than just a creaky old house. Then came the scratching. It started as a soft, drawn-out sound, like fingernails scraping against wood. It wasn't the same as the tapping, and it made Sarah's skin crawl. She would sit up in bed, staring at the closet, willing herself not to look at the door. But she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she would turn her head, and there it was, a deep, disturbing scrape against the closet door, as if something was inside trying to get out. The first time it happened, Sarah jumped out of bed, her heart hammering in her chest. She rushed over to the closet, flinging the door open, but of course there was nothing there. Just her clothes hanging neatly on the rack. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt heavier now, filled with an unseen tension. As the days passed, the tapping and scratching became a regular occurrence. But it wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was something worse. One evening, after dinner, Sarah went into her room to do her homework. Her parents were downstairs watching TV. She felt an overwhelming urge to open the closet door. She didn't know why, but she had to look. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, the dark wood seeming to swallow the light from her lamp. Then, slowly, she reached for the handle. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. There, behind her clothes, were eyes. Two wide, dark eyes, peering out from the shadows. They weren't human eyes, at least not the way eyes should be. They were cold, unblinking, staring at her from the depths of the closet. Sarah's heart raced as she backed away, her hands shaking. She slammed the door shut, but the eyes lingered in her mind. Their unyielding gaze burned into her memory. The next night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, wide awake, her eyes fixed on the closet door. She could hear the tapping, a steady rhythm that echoed through the walls. Tap, tap, tap. But now, it wasn't just the tapping. She could feel something, someone, watching her. The air in her room grew colder, heavier, and she shivered despite the warmth of her blankets. Then came the scratching again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just random, it was deliberate, like something was trying to communicate with her. The nails against the wood scraped in jagged, frantic movements. Sarah's pulse quickened. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. And then, from the closet, the voice came. A rasping whisper that slithered into her ears, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. The voice sounded wrong, twisted, like it was coming from the deepest, darkest part of the closet. She knew it wasn't her imagination anymore. The eyes were real, and whatever was behind the closet door was alive. Terrified, Sarah bolted from her bed, her feet moving on their own as she ran down the hallway to her parents. But when she reached their room, she froze in the doorway. Her parents were fast asleep, unaware of what was happening in Sarah's room. With a trembling hand, she reached for the door to her room again. But when she opened it, there was no tapping, no scratching, no eyes staring back at her. It was silent, almost too silent. The closet door stood wide open, empty, as if nothing had ever been there. But Sarah knew better. She could still feel the weight of those eyes on her, burning into the back of her neck. The tapping never stopped. The scratching continued, and every night Sarah could feel those eyes following her, waiting for the right moment to finally come out from behind the clothes and take her. She just hoped it wouldn't be tonight. Story number 4. The Cursed Playground. The old playground at the edge of town had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Its rusty swings and broken merry-go-round a reminder of a time long past. It was a place that children would dare each other to visit, but no one stayed after dark. There were stories about the playground, stories whispered in the dark corners of schoolyards, about strange things that happened when the sun went down. The swings would move on their own. The merry-go-round would spin without wind, and some said you could hear laughter from children who weren't there. The older kids warned the younger ones to stay away, but like all stories, the more they were told, the more tempting the place became. Mark and Lily were different. They didn't believe in ghosts or curses. They were brave, always looking for new adventures. So, when the sun began to dip below the horizon one evening, they decided to go to the old playground. They figured the stories were just that. Stories. They were sure they could handle whatever was out there. As they approached the playground, the familiar sights greeted them. The rusted swing swaying gently, the old merry-go-round creaking in the breeze, and the half-broken slide standing tall like a forgotten monument. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the faint scent of grass. The playground, while forgotten by most, still felt alive in some strange way. Mark reached for one of the swings and pushed it with a lazy hand. It creaked loudly, but there was no wind to make it move. He turned to Lily with a smug smile, but Lily wasn't looking at the swing. Her eyes were on the merry-go-round, which was turning slowly, as if it had a life of its own. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shrugged. "It's just the wind. Let's see if we can make it go faster." But when he reached for the merry-go-round, something stopped him. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder, and the sky had shifted from orange to a deep purple. The sun had slipped below the horizon, and the shadows of the playground seemed to stretch longer, like fingers reaching out to grab them. "Let's go back," Lily said, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt wrong. Mark, not wanting to seem scared, laughed it off. "It's fine. We're just messing with our heads. Come on, let's stay a little longer." They both sat on the swings. Mark gave his a push, and Lily did the same. The swings moved back and forth, creaking loudly. At first, it was just the sound of the chains rattling. But then, there was something else. A soft sound that came from the other side of the playground. It was a laughter, faint and distant, but it wasn't the kind of laughter children make when they're playing. It was low, eerie, like the sound of someone enjoying a cruel joke. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mark didn't respond at first. He was still swinging, but he was looking around now, his face pale. The laughter wasn't fading. It was getting closer. Then the swings stopped moving. Not because they had slowed down, but because the chains had gone still. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. Mark's stomach churned. The merry-go-round had stopped spinning too, as if frozen in place. Lily stood up, her legs wobbly. "Mark, we need to go, now." But Mark didn't move. His eyes were locked on something in the distance near the rusty slide. Something was there. It wasn't a person, but it looked like a shadow, moving in the dim light, stretching long across the playground. "I don't think we can leave," Mark said, his voice hollow. Suddenly, the laughter erupted again, but this time it was louder. It was no longer distant, it was everywhere, surrounding them. Mark and Lily looked around, but there was no one there. The playground had come alive, and it wasn't playing by their rules anymore. The merry-go-round began to spin again, faster this time, though there was no wind. The swings began to sway violently, creaking as though they were trying to break free from their chains. And then the shadow near the slide moved. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a shape. A figure that seemed to be made of darkness itself, its form shifting and twisting. Mark grabbed Lily's arm. "We have to run." They both bolted toward the exit, but the closer they got to the gate, the further it seemed to move. The playground was pulling them back, the laughter getting louder and louder, like it was mocking them. They finally reached the gate, but when they tried to open it, the latch wouldn't budge. It was as if the playground had claimed them, holding them there with invisible chains. And then, from the corner of their eyes, they saw it. The figure. It wasn't far behind them now, moving with a purpose. They could hear its footsteps, heavy and slow, like someone dragging their feet across the ground. "Please, no," Lily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The figure stopped, It was standing just behind them now. Its form was tall and dark, but there was something about it, something that made their hearts race faster. The face was wrong. There was no face, just a void, an empty space where a face should be. And then the laughter stopped. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, its fingers stretching impossibly long. "Welcome," it whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 children speaking at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The gate flew open and the wind rushed through, pushing them out onto the street. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They never went back to that playground again. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, Mark and Lily could still hear the faint laughter in the distance, echoing through the night. The playground was waiting, and it always would be. Story number 5. The Man Beneath the Bed. Emily had always been a sound sleeper. From the moment her head hit the pillow, it was as if the world outside her room disappeared. The darkness felt safe, comforting even, and the quiet of the night was something she had grown used to. But lately, things had changed. It started slowly, just a soft scraping sound that she first thought was the wind. She convinced herself it was nothing, just the house settling or the trees brushing against the window. But as the nights wore on, the sound grew louder, sharper, like something, or someone, was moving beneath her bed. At first, Emily didn't want to admit it. She was 10 years old, after all, too old to be scared of silly things. So, she kept it to herself, lying in bed with her eyes squeezed shut, pretending she couldn't hear the scraping from the floor beneath her. But it wasn't long before the sound became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just scraping anymore, it was something else. A faint whisper, like a voice too quiet to make out. But there. Soft at first, like a rustling leaf, then clearer and closer, as if someone was speaking directly to her. She tried to pull the covers over her head, to shut it all out, but it wasn't enough. The whispers grew louder, filling the dark corners of her room, pulling her in. "Emily." The voice was soft, like a sigh. It wasn't her parents, she knew that. It was something different, something wrong. She turned over in her bed, trying to ignore it, but the whispers only got worse. They weren't clear enough to understand, but she could tell they were meant for her. Something was beneath her bed, and it wasn't happy that she was ignoring it. The next morning, Emily tried to tell her parents about it. She mentioned the scraping, the whispers, the feeling that something was there in the dark, watching her. But they just smiled and shook their heads. "Nightmares, honey," her mom said softly. "It's just your imagination. There's nothing under your bed." Her dad, with his usual tired laugh, added, "Old houses make noises, Em." "You're fine. It's nothing to worry about." But it was something to worry about. Emily wasn't sure what it was, but the longer the noises continued, the more certain she became that something was under there, and it was getting closer. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. The scraping was so loud now, it sounded like claws dragging against wood. And the whispers, there was no mistaking it this time. They were words. Words she didn't understand, but words nonetheless. It sounded like someone was trying to speak to her, trying to tell her something, but she couldn't make out what. The air in her room grew cold, a chill that crept under the covers and froze her skin. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she lay motionless, staring at the dark ceiling. Her eyes darted toward the edge of the bed, toward the space she knew she could never reach. And then, it happened. The bed creaked. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the mattress shifted slightly, as if something beneath it was moving. She held her breath, waiting for it to stop, but the bed shifted again. And this time, there was no mistaking it. Something was under the bed. Her eyes were wide with terror as she slowly slid out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. The scraping continued, and the whispers, now clearer than ever, filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Emily." The voice was softer now, more coaxing. "Come closer." She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. But the voice, it was inviting her. The desire to look was overwhelming, but part of her, the smarter part, knew it was a terrible idea. Her parents were asleep down the hall, and no one would be able to help her if she went looking for whatever was under the bed. But then, as the whispers grew louder, it felt like they were calling her name again and again, like the thing beneath her bed was desperate for her attention. "Emily, I'm waiting." Finally, the fear overcame her common sense. She knelt down, slowly, her heart thumping so hard in her chest that she thought it might explode. She leaned over the side of the bed, her breath coming in sharp gasps. And there, in the dim light of the moon, she saw it. 2 holes, no, not holes, eyes in the darkness. The blackness under her bed wasn't empty. It was a shape, a figure, and it wasn't human. The holes where its eyes should have been stared up at her with a hunger she could feel deep inside her chest. The whispers stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Emily's blood ran cold as she stared at the shape beneath her bed, realizing that whatever it wasn't interested in leaving anytime soon. It wanted her. Before she could react, before she could scream or run, the voice returned, louder than before, as if it had grown bolder with the realization that it had her attention. "Emily, you can't leave." The figure under her bed shifted again, and Emily felt the floor beneath her tremble. The weight of it was like a presence filling the room, closing in around her, suffocating her with its nearness. Her pulse raced. She had to get out, she had to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't stop herself from inching closer, drawn to the thing under the bed, as if it had some power over her, something she couldn't fight. And then, as if it had heard her thoughts, the voice whispered one last time, clearer than ever. "You shouldn't have looked." The bed creaked loudly, as if something had reached up and grabbed her, yanking her into the dark. The next morning, Emily's parents found her room exactly the way they'd left it. Neat, untouched. There was no sign of her. No scream, no struggle, just a cold emptiness where their daughter had been. But if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the faint scraping, the whispering voice calling out in the dark. And if you're brave enough, you might even hear it call your name. Story number 6. The Mirror in the Basement. Josh had always been curious. Maybe too curious for his own good. The old house on the edge of town had always intrigued him. It had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its door hanging crooked on its hinges. No one lived there, but the stories about it were enough to make any kid's imagination run wild. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened inside, things that didn't make sense, things that shouldn't be possible. But there was one thing that always stood out to Josh: the mirror in the basement. The adults warned him about it, of course. His grandmother had told him, his mother had told him, and even the neighbor down the street had warned him. "Don't go near the basement," they all said, their voices low and serious. "There's something down there, Josh. You don't want to mess with it." Josh, being young and stubborn, never listened. He had heard the stories before, about how the mirror was no ordinary mirror. It wasn't like the ones you saw in any other house. This mirror was special, antique, hand-carved, and passed down from generation to generation. People said it showed the truth. Not the reflection of what was in front of it, but something deeper, something more sinister, and it called to him. Late one evening, when the sun was low and the house grew quiet, Josh found himself standing in front of the basement door. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of that unmistakable pull, the same kind of pull that had led him to stare at the house for days, wondering about what was hidden inside. He knew he shouldn't go down there. The stories ran through his mind like a dark soundtrack, warning him to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The basement door creaked open with an eerie sound, and Josh stepped inside. The air smelled musty, old, and damp. The stairs groaned under his feet as he descended into the darkness below. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw it. The mirror. It stood against the far wall, its frame intricately carved with dark, twisting patterns that seemed almost alive. Josh had seen it before, but never this close. He could feel the weight of it, the energy it gave off, like something was watching him from the other side. He stood there for a moment, just staring at it, almost hypnotized by the ripples that danced across the surface. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but no. The surface of the mirror wasn't still, it was moving, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. And then, without warning, Josh saw something. Someone. At first, he thought it was just his reflection, but it wasn't. Not entirely. It was him, yes, but something was wrong. The figure in the mirror wasn't just staring back at him, it was grinning. The smile was wide and twisted, its eyes black and cold, filled with malice. It was as if the reflection wasn't his at all, but someone, or something, else, using his face as a mask. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and Josh felt his stomach twist with dread. Josh. The voice came from the mirror, low and rasping, but it was unmistakable. His name. His breath caught in his throat. His body went rigid with fear, but his feet wouldn't move. He couldn't look away. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, as if the glass was no longer a barrier. Josh reached out, his hand shaking, but the mirror's surface rippled again, as though it were water, distorting his reflection even more. The figure grinned wider, its mouth opening in a way that shouldn't have been possible, stretching too far. "Come closer," the reflection whispered, its voice like a cold breeze brushing his skin. "I've been waiting for you." Josh's heart pounded, and his instincts screamed at him to run. But something held him there, trapped in the basement with the mirror and the thing inside it. The reflection wasn't just watching him anymore, it was reaching for him. The hand in the mirror stretched out, fingers reaching through the rippling surface, inches from his own. Josh stumbled backward, but the figure in the mirror didn't stop. It grinned even wider, and its eyes glinted with something darker now, hunger. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice turning to a growl. "I will find you." Terrified, Josh turned and ran, his feet pounding against the cold concrete floor. He could hear the scraping of nails against glass as he bolted up the stairs, but he didn't dare look back. His heart was racing in his chest as he slammed the basement door shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house. But even as he ran, even as he tried to escape, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with him. Something in the house. Something following him. The mirror had called to him, and now, no matter how far he ran, he knew it wasn't done with him. The thing in the basement had seen him, and it had marked him. And it was still waiting. Story number 7. The Child Who Never Woke Up. Lena had always been a quiet child, one who didn't demand much attention. She was the kind of kid who sat in the corner, her face buried in books or lost in her own little world, talking to herself. Her parents didn't think much of it. Every child has an imagination, they told themselves. But there was something different about Lena. She often spoke of things that didn't exist, things that seemed strange, even for a child. For months, she talked about him, a man she called the Dark One. Lena said he would visit her at night, sitting at the edge of her bed, speaking in a low, whispering voice. She would tell her parents that he had stories to share, stories about a world beyond the one they lived in, stories of things that were dark, twisted, and impossible. But when they asked her more, Lena would just shake her head saying, "I can't tell you." He doesn't like that. Her parents thought it was just an imaginary friend, the kind of thing kids had when they were young. After all, children had a way of dreaming up stories that made no sense, and Lena had always been a little different. Her parents laughed it off. They never took it seriously. They didn't want to. Then, one morning, Lena didn't wake up. Her parents thought it was just another one of those long, lazy Sunday mornings where she'd sleep in. They didn't think much of it when they called to her from downstairs and got no answer. But after a while, when they went up to check, they found her lying in bed, her body still and cold. At first, they thought it was a nightmare. Maybe she'd had a bad dream, something too real to wake up from. Maybe it was some kind of sleep disorder. But the more they looked at her peaceful face, almost as if she were just resting, the more they realized that something wasn't right. Something was wrong. Lena hadn't just fallen asleep, she was gone. Her parents called the doctor, who said the same thing everyone else would say when something like this happened. Maybe she'd had some kind of medical condition that they hadn't known about. A rare disease, something no one had seen before. But no one had answers. There was nothing wrong with Lena, at least, nothing they could find. It was only after they decided to clean up her room that they found it. A small, crumpled piece of paper was hidden under her pillow. At first, her mother thought it was just a note that Lena had written for school, or maybe a doodle of some kind. But when she unfolded it, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The note was written in a shaky, childlike hand, the letters crooked and uneven, as though Lena had written it in a hurry. It read, "He's coming for you too." The words felt like a weight pressing on her chest. She read them over and over, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what they meant. Who was coming? Who had written it? Her first instinct was to dismiss it. It was just a note, a scribbled mess of words. But then she thought of Lena's stories. Stories about the Dark One. The man she would talk about, the one who visited her at night. Her parents had always brushed it off. They had convinced themselves it was just her imagination. But now, with the note in her hand, and the chill creeping through the room, they couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Something had happened. And it wasn't just a dream. They searched through Lena's room, hoping to find some explanation, some clue that could help them understand. They found nothing. Nothing except for the strange sense of dread that filled the space. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath. That night, her mother couldn't sleep. She kept thinking of Lena's stories, of the Dark One and his tales. She couldn't stop herself from wondering if maybe Lena had known something they hadn't. Had Lena known what was coming? Had the Dark One taken her? As the hours passed, her mother finally got out of bed and went into the kitchen, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She tried to distract herself, to do something normal, but as she moved toward the door to the basement, she froze. From the shadows in the hallway there came a voice. Soft at first, just a whisper, but unmistakable. a voice she hadn't heard in years. "I'm here," it said. It was the voice of a man, a low, calm voice filled with malice and certainty. Her heart stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was too familiar. It was the same voice Lena had told her about, the voice of the Dark One, the man who came at night. And now, as the door to the basement creaked open slowly, her heart filled with terror. She knew that whatever had taken Lena, whatever had been waiting in the shadows, was coming for her too. Her grip on the doorknob tightened. She didn't want to turn the handle, didn't want to open the door, but she knew she had no choice, because the Dark One wasn't finished, and now he was coming for her. And there was no escape. Story number 8, The Last Laugh. Evan had never been one for toys. He wasn't like the other kids who would play with dolls or action figures for hours on end. But when his parents brought home a small, quirky clown figurine for his birthday, they thought it might be a fun, unique gift. It wasn't like the usual toys Evan liked. No, this was something different. Something that would stand out in his room. They didn't think much of it, thinking it would just be a cute decoration on his shelf. The clown figurine was small, about the size of a coffee mug, with bright colors that didn't quite fit together, reds, yellows, and blues that seemed to clash rather than complement. Its painted face was frozen in a grin, but there was something about that grin that made Evan uneasy. The eyes were too wide, the smile too big, as though it was hiding something. Still, Evan didn't complain. He placed it on his shelf like a good boy and moved on to the rest of his birthday celebrations. At night, when everything was quiet, Evan would lie in his bed, trying to sleep. But something about the room felt off. The shadows in his room seemed to grow longer, more pronounced, and the moonlight coming through the window cast eerie shapes against the walls. It was during these long, restless nights that Evan first began to hear it. It started as a soft chuckle, so faint that at first he thought he was imagining it. He'd lie there, listening, unsure if it was just the house creaking or the wind blowing outside. But every night, as the hours grew later, the sound grew louder, until it was unmistakable. A low, creepy laugh, almost like a soft wheeze, coming from the direction of the shelf. Evan would sit up in bed, his heart racing. His eyes would dart around the room, looking for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the darkened room and that stupid clown on the shelf, grinning like it knew a terrible secret. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just his imagination, or maybe a noise from the house settling. But as the nights went on, the laughing grew more frequent, and it wasn't just a chuckle anymore. It was a full-on laugh, almost mocking, like the clown knew something Evan didn't. One night, unable to take it any longer, Evan jumped out of bed and stormed over to the shelf. He picked up the clown, glaring at it. "Stop it," he whispered fiercely. "You're not funny." For a moment, the room was silent. Evan waited, but there was nothing. The clown was still, its painted grin as unsettling as ever. He stared at it for a long time, trying to convince himself it was just a toy, nothing more. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next night, when Evan heard the laugh again, he went straight to his parents' room. He tugged at his mom's sleeve, waking her up. "Mom," he whispered urgently. "The clown, it's laughing again." His mother, still half asleep, smiled and patted his head. "Oh, Evan, it's just your imagination. Go back to bed, there's nothing to be afraid of." Evan hesitated. "But it's moving, Mom. It's not like before, it's different." His mother chuckled softly. "Sweetheart, it's just a figurine. You're letting your mind run wild. Now go to sleep, okay?" But Evan knew. He knew what he was hearing. He couldn't explain it, but he felt it. The clown wasn't just a decoration, it was something else. The next morning, Evan's parents were woken by an odd feeling. There was a strange silence in the house. No sound of Evan's footsteps, no chatter. His father, half awake, went to check on him. When he opened Evan's bedroom door, he froze. Evan's bed was empty. At first, his dad thought Evan was just playing around, hiding under the blankets or in the closet. But when he turned on the light and searched the room, he saw it. The clown figurine sitting innocently on the shelf, but its smile. It was wider now. Much wider. The grin stretched almost unnaturally across its painted face, the corners of its mouth curling up in a way that made it look like it was laughing. "Lena," Evan's dad called out to his wife, his voice shaky. "Lena, something's wrong. Evan's gone." His wife rushed in, eyes widening when she saw the bed. "Where is he? Where did he go?" The room was still, but the air felt heavy, thick with something they couldn't explain. They searched the house, calling out for Evan, but there was no answer, not a sound. As they stepped back into the bedroom, Lena's eyes went to the clown on the shelf. She stared at it for a long moment, a chill running through her. The smile was too big now, the eyes too dark, and she could swear, just for a second, that it moved, its head turning slightly as if acknowledging her presence. And then, as if it had been waiting for them to notice, the clown's laugh echoed through the room. It was a laugh that didn't belong to any toy, a laugh that was too real, too alive. And as it rang out, a cold realization settled over them. Evan wasn't coming back. The clown had taken him. And now it was waiting for someone else to hear its last laugh. Story number 9. The Red Balloon. Timmy had always wanted a red balloon. It was something he couldn't explain. A desire that clung to him like a shadow. Always there, always persistent. He'd ask his parents for one, over and over, but they always said the same thing. "No, Timmy, you're too old for that now. Red balloons are for little kids." They would laugh it off, thinking it was just a phase. But for Timmy, it wasn't a phase. It was a need, an urge that only seemed to grow stronger as time went on. The first time he saw it, he thought it was a dream. It was one of those quiet nights when the world outside seemed to be holding its breath. The moonlight filtered through his window, casting long shadows across the room. Timmy lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about how much he wanted that red balloon. He closed his eyes for a moment, just to rest them, and when he opened them again, there it was, floating at the foot of his bed. A red balloon. Timmy sat up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The balloon was there, real, in front of him, its bright red color standing out against the darkened room. The string was tied tight, and it floated just above the floor, as if someone had placed it there for him. His first thought was that it had come from his parents. Maybe they had finally decided to give him one after all. But when he called out to them, there was no response. His parents' bedroom door was closed, and the house was still, eerily quiet. Timmy's excitement turned to hesitation. He reached out for the balloon, the soft string slipping through his fingers as he pulled it toward him. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, but something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but there was something off about it. It wasn't just a balloon. It was waiting for him. The string tugged slightly as if urging him to follow it. Timmy stood up, still holding the balloon, and looked around. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer. He stepped carefully toward the door, his bare feet cold against the floorboards. The string seemed to pull him toward the hallway, guiding him, making him want to go down the dark, narrow corridor, even though he knew he shouldn't. He hesitated, But the balloon pulled him again, stronger this time, urging him forward. He could hear his parents' voices in his head, warning him not to go out there. "It's just a balloon," he told himself. "There's nothing to be afraid of." But the more he thought about it, the more the darkness seemed to wrap itself around him, pulling him towards something he couldn't see. The hallway felt colder the further he went, the darkness pressing in around him like a living thing. The string tugged again, pulling him toward a door at the end of the hall, a door he had never seen before. It stood there, old and wooden, with peeling paint and a brass knob that seemed to glint in the faint light. Timmy's heart raced. His hand shook as he reached for the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing only blackness beyond. But the balloon, his balloon, floated right into the darkness, as if it knew where it was going. Timmy stood frozen in the doorway, the chill in the air biting at his skin. The balloon floated higher now, just out of reach, as if it were beckoning him to follow. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to run back to his room, to call for his parents. But his body wouldn't obey. Night after night, the balloon came back. It didn't matter how much he tried to ignore it. The red balloon would always be there when he woke up in the dark of the night, waiting for him at the foot of his bed. Each time it came, it floated a little higher, a little farther away, as if it were pushing him to follow it, to go through the door in the dark hallway. He tried to tell his parents, but they always brushed it off. "It's just your imagination," they'd say, laughing it off like they had before. "You've been dreaming again." But Timmy knew the truth. The balloon wasn't just a toy. It wasn't something from his imagination. It was leading him somewhere. Somewhere he didn't want to go. And every night as the balloon floated higher, Timmy felt the pull growing stronger. Something was waiting for him behind that door, something he could feel but not see. He didn't know what it was, but the closer he got to it, the more he realized it was calling to him. One night, he couldn't resist it anymore. The balloon was too close, too powerful. He followed the string down the hallway once more, his feet moving on their own, his heart pounding in his chest. The door stood open, as if it had been waiting for him. The balloon floated in and Timmy stepped forward. And as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into complete darkness. The balloon, still floating in front of him, was now the only thing he could see. It was brighter now, glowing in the dark, its red color almost too vivid, too alive. Timmy's breath caught in his throat as a voice whispered from the darkness, "You should have never followed me, Timmy." And in that moment, Timmy realized that the balloon hadn't been waiting for him at all. It had been waiting for the right time to lead him into the dark, where he would never be seen again. Story number 10. The Nightmare Before Sunrise. Carla had always been the kind of person who had nightmares. Everyone did from time to time, right? The kind of dreams that felt too real, too vivid, but nothing that couldn't be shaken off by the morning. But the nightmare she had last week, that nightmare, was different. It wasn't like anything she had experienced before. It didn't leave when she woke up. It lingered, hanging over her like a shadow, refusing to let her go. It started simple enough. At first, it was just a bad dream. She was running, though she didn't know why. She couldn't see who or what was chasing her, but she could feel it, its presence. It was always there, just behind her, breathing heavily, its breath cold against her neck. She would sprint through the dark, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to get away. But no matter how fast she ran, she never got far enough. The coldness would creep up behind her, like a hand on her shoulder, only to disappear when she turned around. The sound of breathing was getting closer. Every step she took, the sound got louder, more suffocating. When she woke up, drenched in sweat, the relief was short-lived. The dream ended, but the coldness, the feeling, stayed with her. Carla would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her heart still racing. She told herself it was just a dream. But that nagging feeling that it was still there, still waiting, wouldn't go away. And every time she closed her eyes, even in the daylight, she felt like it was right there beside her. She could almost hear the breathing, the slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale, filling the silence around her. The next night, the dream came back. And the night after that. And every night after that, like clockwork. The same nightmare, the same feeling of being chased by something she could never see. It was as if the nightmare was hunting her, trying to find a way to crawl out of her dreams and into the waking world. And the worst part wasn't the running, or the dark, or the cold. It was that in her dream, she knew something was following her. She knew it wasn't just in her head. After a few days, Carla began to feel it even when she was awake. The line between the dream and reality blurred, and soon she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She'd catch herself glancing over her shoulder, certain she felt someone, or something, standing right behind her. She'd hear a breath, a soft exhale, like someone was in the room with her. But when she turned around, there was nothing there. The fear started to eat at her, eating into her thoughts until she couldn't think of anything else. She was afraid to sleep, afraid to close her eyes for fear that the nightmare would be waiting for her. Her friends noticed the change. Carla's once bright, friendly smile had turned into something hollow. She'd snap at them when they tried to make jokes or cheer her up. Her eyes were always tired, even though she hadn't slept well in days. But how could she explain it? How could she tell them that she was being hunted by something that didn't even exist? That every time she closed her eyes, it was waiting for her? Then one night, as the moonlight slipped through the cracks in her bedroom curtains, something changed. Carla woke up to the sound of breathing. But this time, it wasn't in her dream, it was real. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she froze, listening. The sound was so familiar, so close. She slowly turned her head, half expecting to see someone standing at the foot of her bed. But there was nothing. The room was dark and still. Still, the breathing continued, slow and deep. It was coming from inside the room, right beside her bed. Her blood ran cold. She reached for the light switch, her hand trembling, but before she could even turn it on, the breathing stopped. She sat up, her breath quickening. Nothing moved. The room was silent again, except for her pounding heart. But the nightmare didn't stop there. From that moment on, it was as if the boundaries between the dream and reality had dissolved completely. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel it. The presence of something right next to her. It was always there, just out of sight, waiting for her to slip back into the nightmare. Sleep became impossible. Even during the day, when she thought she could finally escape, the feeling lingered. The shadows seemed deeper, darker. Her own reflection in the mirror seemed different, as though someone else was looking back at her. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the distance, felt like it was part of the dream, part of the chase. She could hear the breathing again, low and steady, right behind her, but when she turned around, no one was there. The nightmare had bled into her waking life. And Carla knew that sooner or later she wouldn't be able to tell the difference anymore. It would claim her, take her, until there was nothing left. She had become a part of the dream, and there was no waking up from it now. When the sun finally rose, it was the first time Carla had slept in days. But she didn't wake up in her bed. She never woke up at all.